Hi guys, and welcome back to our debate videos, and in this video we'll be continuing our discussion about how to construct an argument. And I'm going to give you a second method about argument construction that you can use in your debates. In this method, you have to follow a certain number of steps to get to your argument. The first step is to decide what conclusion do you want to prove. Secondly, ask yourself questions that anybody would ask in trying to prove that conclusion or trying to answer that question. Thirdly, decide which of those questions are characterization questions. Fourthly, decide which of those questions are contentious questions that your opposition are likely to oppose or have a different answer to. Asking yourself which part of my argument is the opposition most likely to contest is a good way to identify what part of your argument needs to become more robust. So never create an argument in isolation to possible attacks that could come up from your opposition side. Then you're going to tie back your argument to the motion, and lastly show strategic importance of that argument. Cool beans. So let's do a few examples to really drive this home, to make this clear to you guys. So the first motion we're going to do is this House would re-establish the death penalty in South Africa. And the argument we want to try and answer and try and prove in this debate or in this session is, should the right to life be absolute? And as the proposition side, we have to argue that the right to life should not be absolute. Now, most of you in this debate will come up and be like, people that have killed another person should have their right to life taken away. But you've missed a very big premise that needs to be had in that debate, needs to be explained in that debate for that debate to work. And that's, should the right to life be something that we can't limit? You have to have an argument in that debate about when you would limit the right to life and if that's a justifiable thing to do. And that's the point of this argument today, that's where we're trying to get the conclusion we are trying to reach. So second step, ask yourself a number of neutral questions about the conclusion you want. So the questions I would ask myself, if anybody told me that statement, would be: 1, what is the right to life? 2, why is the right to life currently seen as absolute? 3, are there any instances in which we do limit the right to life? 4, how should we be thinking about or constructing rights in our society? And 5, when can we limit the right to life? Now, with every question that you have, you will see that some of them are more characterization questions and the others are far more contentious questions. The characterization questions are questions you're going to have to add meat to your debate, to make your arguments more robust. So you wouldn't necessarily spend so much of your time on the characterization questions, but the contentious questions you would. So for example, in this argument, the contentious questions you would be asking yourself is, are there instances in which the right to life is not absolute? So here's proposition. We'll be trying to paint with this question a precedent that there are instances in which we do limit the right to life already to some extent. For example, when we send people to war-torn situations where there's a high probability of death, or when we allow people to refuse medical treatment, or when we allow, in some instances, assisted suicide in some societies. So those are instances in which we are currently able to limit the right to life, and that only shows a precedent or a trend that this is something we should be able to do and should be able to extend from. The real contentious questions are, how should we think about rights moving forward, and when do we think rights should be limited? So there you're going to have answers pertaining to the fact that we think rights should be constructed in terms of their individual value. So here's how I'm going to think about my opposition's response. My opposition's response is likely going to be that the right to life is important because that's where all other rights derive their importance from. So by answering this question about how should we conceptually think about rights, I can already outline that rights need to be thought about in isolation to other rights, because we don't think one right should only be important because it gives another right value. That right in and of itself needs to be valuable. By thinking of that, I've already put in a strength and steel against a possible argument that could come up from my opposition side by having a look at what the main contention to my questions are from the other side. Moreover, we think rights should be given to things that are valuable. So the reason why we don't think animals have complete rights, because we don't think that we value their right to life all the time in all instances, and that's why we allow people to eat meat, for instance. And therefore, if we believe that a criminal's life has stopped having value to society, what is the purpose of keeping them in prison and keeping them in our justice system if we no longer find a value to having them exist in our society at all? Now, the last question, which is contentious, is why can we limit rights, and why is it okay to limit rights? And there we're going to argue simply that we think that rights work on a basis of trade-offs, that we're always trading off something in society, that we decide and we give value to things as a society based on trade-offs, and therefore the inability to limit a right means we can never make a trade-off in that particular instance, and we think that blanket approach is harmful to how we are constructing rights moving forward. So after we've constructed and answered all those questions, we would then have to show the strategic importance of that argument in our debate. So the reason why it's so important is because it forces the opposition to actually tell us why the right to life should always be valuable. I think that's a core part of that debate, because if we can limit the right to life, all we have to show is that this instance is an instance in which the right to life can be justifiably limited. Cool. Now moving on to another example. So let's take the motion. This tells us that the transgender community should seek to actively distance itself from the LGBTQI community. Cool beans. So let's say the conclusion you want to prove or reach in that debate is that LGBT issues do not reflect trans issues. So, second step is ask yourself neutral questions anybody who hears that statement would ask. So questions I would ask would be, what are the issues of the trans community? What are the aims of the trans community? What are the issues of the LGBTQ community? What are the aims of the LGBTQ community? Why do the aims of the LGBT community not reflect those of the transgender community? And lastly, will that always be the case, or is there an instance in which they could possibly come to a point where those issues can be equally reflected? So once again, ask yourself which questions are more characterization questions and which ones are more contentious questions. So in terms of the aims of the trans community, even though there will be differences there and argumentation there in terms of how you're going to characterize what those aims look like, it's probably not going to be the most contentious part of that argument. The most contentious part of the argument comes in when we're looking at why do we think those aims will always fall under prioritization or will never be reflected in terms of how the LGBT community is currently structured. So there we have to give answers such as, for example, the differences in terms of gender and sexuality and what that means when we are constructing a movement that conflates those two ideologies. Or the fact that social capital generally tends to belong to the group that has most numbers, and therefore the trans community, being a minority group, would always lack in their abilities being at the center stage in terms of that community. So that's where you would spend most of your time in the argument construction to answer that question about why we think trans issues will always be neglected in comparison to LGBTQI issues. So after you've answered all those questions, you would then once again tie it back to the motions and then show strategic importance of that argument in the debate itself. Cool. And our last motion or our last example for today is going to be, this house prefers a world in which people believe in destiny as opposed to a world in which people believe in free will. So let's say the argument, one of the conclusions we want to reach in that debate is that destiny allows people to better withstand hardships. And here, once again, we're going to ask ourselves neutral questions about that statement that anybody would generally ask. So those questions would be, 1, what do people regard as destiny? Or how do they conceptually think of destiny? 2, when do people need destiny? 3, what do people think of as free will? 4, when do people need free will? 5, which hardships do we think people are generally going to need destiny for? And what is the nature of those hardships? And 6, which one, destiny or free will, better equips them to be able to deal with that hardship? So a lot of those questions are characterization questions. And the most contentious one, where your opposition is most likely to contest you on, is on which one is most likely going to help somebody in hardship, for example. So there you come up with answers, for example, the fact that some hardships and the nature of hardship is that generally it's issues that you cannot overcome by your free will. We're talking about things like death or an illness. And no matter how hard you try, or no matter how hard you fight that circumstance, there is no ability for you to change that circumstance. And the reason we prefer destiny in that particular instance is because destiny tells you that even though you can't change that circumstance forms part of a greater goal, forms part of something bigger that you are part of, and therefore it allows people to be able to rationalize and deal with hardships better, especially when those hardships are unchangeable hardships in society. So that's an example, or all the examples of how you can use questions and working backwards from a conclusion to build arguments. I hope this really helps, and keep tuned for more videos.